So the next person we're talking about is Henry Middleton. Henry Middleton is an interesting founder. When the call went out for the first Continental Congress to come together, Henry Middleton from South Carolina was an obvious choice. He'd already been in the Colonial Assembly for decades. He was already an older man and one of the wealthiest people in South Carolina, owned a nice big plantation, a lot of slaves. I should probably look up the number, I'm not sure, more than any person should, but either way, a very wealthy, influential member of colonial South Carolina. So he gets sent to the First Continental Congress to do First Continental Congress things, aka write a boycott and send a petition to the king. And he signs what becomes known as the Continental Association, as well as the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, as most of the delegates at the time, some of who would be loyalists, did at the end of the 6 weeks of the First Continental Congress. What's interesting about Henry Middleton in particular is Peyton Randolph of Virginia had been elected president of the First Continental Congress. Now, at the time, it wasn't president of the United States. The president of Continental Congress was essentially the chairman of Continental Congress to oversee the discussion, keep people restrained, keep order in the courtroom, for lack of a better term. And Henry Middleton was there when Peyton Randolph leaves. Again, it's a ceremonial position, but you did have to sign important things. Any correspondence, any official correspondence from the First Continental Congress or any of the Continental Congresses was signed by the President of Congress. But Peyton Randolph, after they all signed the Continental Association, he heads home for Virginia. But there were still a few things they had to tidy up, so they needed someone to take over. And they elected Henry Middleton, who sits as President of the Continental Congress for 4 days. That's it. Just 4 days, but he does get to be one of those guys on that list. Either way, while they're there, they still have to send the Continental Association that they all signed, they have to send that to England. Specifically, the state representatives there. They weren't states yet, they were colonies. Each colony had separate agents, as they were called, or representatives in London, who spoke for the colony to the crown and to Parliament, but were not actually government officials. Now, two of these people were Benjamin Franklin, who was at this point representing at least 3 states, and Arthur Lee, representing Virginia, a member of the Lee family, whose brothers were there the whole time, would sign the Declaration later. So they need to be informed, and as president of the organization, who's the only signature they needed, along with the secretary, Charles Thompson, who had to attest to everything, Henry Middleton informs London. He informs Benjamin Franklin and Arthur Lee and the other representatives of the colonies, hey, this is what's going on. So Henry Middleton, he goes back home. They all go back home after the First Continental Congress. I like to say the First Continental Congress was 6 weeks long. The Second Continental Congress was 15 years. So he returns for the Second Continental Congress, and as things get a little more radical, Henry Middleton just isn't really comfortable with that. He's fairly conservative, even though he does side with the Patriots, and he does have these grievances against the king. As an older gentleman, he was slow to take up the cause of independence. So he actually resigns and goes home. Who do they choose in his place? Well, his son Arthur Middleton comes in his place, and his son Arthur's a little bit more radical. He would promote independence almost as soon as he gets there, and Arthur would sign the Declaration of Independence. Between the two of them, they're one of the only father-son tandems to sign multiple documents. Arthur would eventually go back and briefly be governor of South Carolina and become one of the most important leaders of South Carolina. Now, as for his father, today's figure, Henry Middleton, after he goes back home, Henry, again, didn't support independence off the bat, but once independence happens, he does accept a position as a state senator in South Carolina. So he goes to the state senate and participates in the new government. He is a patriot, but unfortunately, he is arrested at one point, and by the British. And the British decide, well, Mr. Middleton, I suggest you declare your allegiance to the king, or we're going to, I don't know, hang you. Maybe we'll put you in a terrible prison cell where you can lavish away and get sick. Now, again, Middleton was already not a very old man, but approaching very old at this point in his life. And he was under duress, and he does eventually declare his allegiance to the king. Now, this is just a year before the victory at Yorktown and the war ends. Middleton, although people are not happy that Henry declared allegiance to the king, He's not persecuted like many other loyalists were. He did not have his property taken away from him. He had served with the state. He stuck with the Patriots despite not necessarily having been for independence in the first place. He does come along when it's decided on. That and his son being such an important political figure in the state at that point helps him not get in too much trouble, and he gets to keep his property, which, as Matthew Davenport was nice enough to point out, he had a 50,000 acre plantation and 800 slaves, which sounds like a lot because it was a lot. He has a gigantic plantation owner, and I believe one of the largest slave owners in South Carolina. And that's a brief overview of the life of Henry Middleton.